It was my first day on the job, and I was excited but nervous. I had just moved to a small town in the Midwest, hoping for a fresh start after the mess my life had become. The company I had just joined was a family-run business, an old bookstore that had been around for decades, passed down through generations. The owner, Mr. Caldwell, was a friendly older man with a penchant for history. He'd promised me that I'd be in charge of organizing inventory and helping customers. Seemed like a perfect, quiet job for someone like me. As soon as I arrived, I was shown to the back room where I'd be working. The store had a musty, old smell to it, the kind of smell that comes from years of dust collecting on the pages of countless books. The back room was dimly lit, but the shelves stacked with old, leather-bound books made it feel more like a cozy haven than an office. But there was something about the room that unsettled me, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up whenever I stepped in there. Maybe it was the old wooden floor that creaked with every step, or the strange, uneven shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally in the dim light. It wasn't long before I noticed the first odd thing: an old grandfather clock in the corner of the room. It was a beautiful piece, intricately carved with scenes of nature and wildlife, but it hadn't worked in years. Mr. Richard Caldwell told me it hadn't chimed since his father passed away, and he had no interest in fixing it. He said it was just an heirloom, a relic from a bygone era. But I could feel the weight of its presence, like it was watching me, waiting for something. As the day wore on, I began to grow accustomed to the place. The hours passed in a blur of dusting bookshelves, sorting through old inventory, and helping a few customers who wandered in to browse. There were moments, though, when I would hear strange sounds coming from the back room, sounds that didn't make sense. The soft shuffle of footsteps when no one was there. The faint scraping of something heavy moving across the floor. The whisper of something almost too quiet to hear. Around midday, I took a break and stepped outside to grab some fresh air. The sun was high, casting long shadows across the street. I could hear the hum of life around me, people chatting, cars passing by, the distant sound of children playing. It was the kind of quiet that you only get in small towns, and I found comfort in it, even as a strange sense of foreboding continued to linger. When I returned to the store, Mr. Caldwell was nowhere to be found. The door to the back room was closed, but I could hear him talking, or at least, I thought it was him. The voice was soft and low, indistinct, like someone speaking in a whisper. I knocked on the door, but there was no response. The voice continued. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. I turned the knob slowly and stepped inside. To my surprise, the room was empty. No sign of Mr. Caldwell, no hint of anyone being there at all. The door to the back hallway was ajar, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. I wasn't sure whether to follow the sound or to just leave the store entirely, but before I could make a decision, I felt a chill creep down my spine, a sensation of being watched. It was the kind of feeling that made your blood run cold, that made every instinct in your body scream to run. Instead, I did the opposite. I walked down the hallway toward the back of the store, where the noise seemed to be coming from. The footsteps grew louder, but they didn't sound like someone walking. It was as if something was dragging itself across the floor. I reached the door at the end of the hall, a small storage closet, and the sound stopped abruptly. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, trying to steady my breath. What the hell was going on? I pushed the door open. There was nothing inside, just boxes of old books and some dusty old furniture. But as my eyes scanned the room, I noticed something on the floor. A piece of paper, yellowed with age and folded in half. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly, and unfolded it. The paper was old, its edges frayed and brittle, but the writing on it was clear, as though it had been written recently. It read, "They never leave. They never let you leave. You have to stay. Forever." My heart skipped a beat. I dropped the paper in a panic, my mind racing. What the hell did that mean? Who wrote it? And why did it feel like it was meant for me? Suddenly, I felt the temperature in the room drop even further, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned around, only to find myself face to face with Mr. Caldwell. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his face was pale, almost as if he had seen a ghost. For a moment, he just stared at me, his lips trembling as though he wanted to say something but couldn't. "You found it," he said quietly. "Found what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The note, he replied. It's been there for years, waiting for someone to find it. I looked at him, confusion and fear spreading across my face. What does it mean? What's going on here? Mr. Caldwell hesitated, his gaze flickering nervously toward the door. It's not just a job here, you know. It's a trap, a curse. My family, they've been trapped in this place for generations. My blood ran cold. What do you mean? He stepped closer to me, his voice shaking. This store, it's not just a bookstore. It's a place where the dead linger, where their souls are trapped. And the clock is the key. Every generation of my family has been drawn here, cursed to work in this store for eternity. And once you start, you can't leave. Ever. I couldn't breathe. The world around me seemed to spin, and my vision blurred. I couldn't process what he was saying. It didn't make sense. But there was something in his eyes, a fear, a desperation that told me he was telling the truth. You have to leave, he whispered urgently. Get out of here before it's too late. The clock, it started again, and once it chimes, there's no going back. Before I could ask what he meant, I heard the unmistakable sound of the grandfather clock ticking. Slowly, steadily, each tick louder than the last. My heart raced. It had been silent for years, but now it was alive again. The room grew darker, the shadows seemed to stretch, and the temperature dropped even further. I could hear whispers, low voices that seemed to come from all around me, from the walls, the shelves, the very air itself. It was then that I realized the job wasn't the only thing I'd been hired for. I had been brought here to join the family, to become part of whatever dark, twisted force that held this place together. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could feel the cold hands of the dead reaching for me, pulling me back. I screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the ticking of the clock. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the face of Mr. Beverly Caldwell, his eyes wide with horror as the clock struck midnight.
Next story.
I remember my first day on the job like it was yesterday. It was supposed to be a typical office gig, nothing special. I had just graduated college and was eager to start my career. The company was reputable, the pay was decent, and everything seemed fine when I walked through those glass doors for the first time. It was an old building, the kind that had that vintage, almost eerie charm. You know, the type with creaky floors and dimly lit hallways. As I made my way up to the office on the 4th floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was thick, like it hadn't been fully aired out in years. But I brushed it off, thinking it was just nerves. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with dark glasses and a tired expression, handed me a stack of paperwork to fill out and directed me to my desk. The place was quiet. Too quiet, really. The hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a printer was the only thing that filled the silence. I noticed a few people scattered around the room, staring at their screens, but no one really spoke. No one seemed friendly, and the air felt colder than it should have been, even for an old office building. I sat down at my desk and started working on the forms. The keyboard clicked loudly, echoing in the otherwise silent room. As I glanced around, I realized that most of the desks were arranged in neat rows, but there was one desk tucked away in the far corner. It was unusual, old and covered in dust, with papers scattered haphazardly across it. The chair at that desk was tilted slightly backward, as though someone had just gotten up, but forgotten to push it in. I asked one of my coworkers about it, trying to sound casual. She barely looked up from her screen, only muttering something about the old manager who used to sit there. Apparently, he had left years ago, but no one had bothered to clean up the space since then. She didn't offer much more information, and I didn't press her on it. It wasn't long before I realized there was something unsettling about the atmosphere here. People didn't look at me when I walked by, and whenever I tried to engage in small talk, it was like they didn't hear me. There was a coldness, a distance in their eyes. They were all too absorbed in their work, too detached from everything around them. But I tried to ignore it, figuring maybe it was just the typical office culture. The day dragged on, and I was starting to get an uneasy feeling. Around lunch, I went to the break room to grab a snack. As I was standing by the microwave, I heard the door behind me creak open. I turned, expecting to see one of my coworkers, but the room was empty. I shrugged it off and went back to my desk. That's when things started to get weird. I couldn't concentrate. My hands were shaking, and the hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed louder than ever. I tried to focus on my work, but every few minutes, I felt like someone was watching me. When I glanced around, no one was looking at me, but the feeling of eyes on me didn't go away. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed a strange noise coming from the back of the office. It was soft at first, like the rustle of paper, but it quickly grew louder. My heart began to race as I looked toward the far corner where the old desk sat. The sound was unmistakable. It was as if someone was rummaging through papers. I stood up, my legs stiff and unwilling to move, and walked slowly toward the source of the noise. As I approached the corner, the room seemed to grow even colder. I shivered as I saw the chair at the old desk move. Just a little at first, like someone had shifted in it, but there was no one there. I stepped closer, my pulse pounding in my ears, and that's when I saw it, a piece of paper lifted from the desk, floating in midair. I froze, unable to move, watching as the paper hovered for a moment before falling to the ground. My heart was hammering in my chest and a chill ran down my spine. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling as I unfolded the paper. It was a handwritten note, and the words were barely legible. "Help me." I felt my stomach twist. I looked around, but there was no one else in sight. The office was empty, and yet I could feel an oppressive presence. It was as though the air itself was thick with something I couldn't see but could almost touch. I hurried back to my desk, my hands slick with sweat, and tried to shake off the feeling. But it only got worse. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature in the office dropped even further. I could see my breath in front of me, again, and I noticed that the lights flickered sporadically. I glanced toward the corner again. The old desk, it seemed to be calling to me. I tried to concentrate on my computer screen, but the sense of dread only deepened. The clicking of the keyboard, the soft shuffle of paper, the creaking of chairs, it all began to echo in my ears. It felt like the walls were closing in. My skin crawled as the sensation of being watched intensified. It was as though invisible hands were pressing against me, suffocating me in their unseen grip. Then I heard a voice. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it came from the corner. "Help me," it whispered. I spun around, my eyes wide with terror. The room was still empty, but the voice wasn't. It was closer now. I could hear it, clearer, more distinct. "Please, help me." I felt my legs wobble beneath me, and I gripped the edge of my desk for support. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in short, panicked gasps. I wanted to run, to leave the office and never look back, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I glanced toward the old desk one more time, and that's when I saw it. A figure. At first, it was just a shadow, a distortion in the air. But then, slowly, it took shape. A man, thin and gaunt, with hollow eyes and pale, almost translucent skin. His clothes were tattered, and his face was twisted in a silent scream. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. I could feel my body shaking uncontrollably, and before I could react, the figure reached out toward me. His fingers were long and skeletal, his grip cold as ice. "Help me," he rasped. I screamed, the sound ripping from my throat as I pulled away. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair, and hit the floor with a hard thud. My breath was coming in ragged gasps as I scrambled to my feet. I looked up, but the figure was gone. The office was silent again, except for the faint sound of the clock ticking on the wall. I didn't know what to do. My head was spinning, my thoughts jumbled. I grabbed my things and rushed toward the elevator. I didn't care if I looked crazy. Nothing was worth staying in that place a second longer. As I pressed the button for the elevator, I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing behind me. But there was nothing. The elevator doors opened, and I practically threw myself inside. As the doors closed, I heard one last whisper, "Help me." The doors slid shut, and the feeling of dread lifted, but I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't coming back.
Next story.
It was my first day on the job at the small antique shop nestled in the corner of an old, forgotten street. The shop had been there for as long as any could remember, its dusty windows always fogged with time, and its sign, "Old Finds," hanging crookedly above the door. The place had an unsettling charm to it. Dim lighting, old wooden floors creaking underfoot, and the smell of aged wood and leather hanging thick in the air. I had always admired it from the outside, fascinated by the array of trinkets and oddities it displayed. The owner, Mr. Alistair, was a peculiar man. thin with wiry glasses perched on his nose, and a voice that carried an almost melodic quality when he spoke. He had greeted me warmly during the interview, his pale blue eyes studying me with an intensity that felt both welcoming and unnerving. "You'll find this place has a life of its own," he'd said, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The shop was small, cluttered with antique furniture, trinkets, and old paintings stacked against the walls. The shelves were filled with strange objects: worn brass lamps, tarnished silverware, books with cracked spines, and a collection of small figurines that seemed to be staring right back at you. It felt like stepping into a forgotten world, one where time stood still, and the items on the shelves held stories of people long gone. That morning, as Mr. Alastair showed me around, he gave me the usual rundown: how to handle the cash register, where the cleaning supplies were, and the store's opening hours. But when it came to a specific room at the back of the shop, he hesitated. "Don't go back there," he said quietly, his eyes narrowing. "That's where we keep the rarer items. You can clean around it, but never touch anything, especially the box on the far shelf." I nodded, trying to hide my curiosity. The room in question was a cramped space with a small window covered in grime, casting slivers of sunlight onto the dust-covered floor. I had already caught a glimpse of the box he mentioned. It was old, carved from some dark wood, and placed carefully on the highest shelf, far from reach. There was something about it that sent a shiver down my spine. The day passed uneventfully, with a few customers wandering in, their faces pale as they scoured the shelves for forgotten treasures. The atmosphere of the shop seemed to cling to them, like an invisible weight, and they always left quickly, as if relieved to escape. I tried to brush off the sense of unease that grew in my chest as the hours went by, focusing on dusting the furniture and organizing the shelves. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that something strange happened. I had been cleaning the front of the shop when I heard the soft chime of the bell above the door. I looked up, expecting another customer, but the shop was empty. The door was slightly ajar, but there was no sign of anyone coming in. I went to the door, puzzled. The street outside was as quiet as ever. No cars, no people walking by, just the faint breeze rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. I closed the door and locked it, but as I turned back to the shop, I saw something in the reflection of the glass. It was the box, the one Mr. Alastair had warned me about. It had moved. I froze, staring at the box in the reflection, my heart pounding. It was no longer sitting neatly on the shelf. It was tilted slightly, as though someone had nudged it. I turned quickly to the back room. No one was there. The room was still, the air thick with silence. "Probably just my imagination," I muttered under my breath, shaking my head. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the shop, the atmosphere grew even heavier. The air felt colder, and I noticed that the old clocks on the wall, ones I hadn't noticed earlier, had all stopped ticking. There was no sound except for the creaking of the wooden floorboards under my feet. I decided to take a break in the staff room, a small space tucked behind the back room where Mr. Alastair had shown me earlier. I sat down, trying to calm my nerves, but as I looked out the small window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure was standing in front of the shop. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell it was a man. He stood motionless, staring at the shop with an eerie stillness. His clothes were old-fashioned, as though he had stepped out of another time. I felt my heart skip a beat, and I instinctively ducked behind the curtain, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't know what to do. Should I call Mr. Alastair? Should I go outside and ask if he needed help? But before I could make up my mind, the figure slowly turned and disappeared into the street, his steps fading into the night. I couldn't shake the image of him, his eyes empty and searching, like something from a nightmare. I sat there in silence, too afraid to move. As the night grew darker, I found myself back in the main room, tidying up the counter and preparing to close up. I kept glancing toward the back room, where the box sat on its shelf, still out of place. The unease I had felt earlier had returned, stronger than before. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from the back room. It was soft at first, like a slow, deliberate knocking. I stood frozen in place, unable to move. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from the box. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The curiosity that had been bubbling inside me finally overcame my fear. I had to know what was inside that box. What was so important that Mr. Alastair had warned me to stay away from it? I walked to the back room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The tapping stopped as I entered, but the air felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. I reached for the box, my fingers brushing the surface of the dark wood. It was cold to the touch, colder than anything I had ever felt before. With trembling hands, I lifted the box from the shelf and opened it. Inside was a small, delicate figurine. It was made of some kind of dark metal, its surface smooth and polished. But it wasn't just any figurine. It was of a man, carved with incredible detail. His face was twisted in an agonizing expression, his hands outstretched as if reaching for something. His eyes seemed to move, following me as I stared at them. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped and the lights flickered. I stumbled back, dropping the box to the floor with a loud crash. The figurine rolled out of the box and onto the floor, its eyes still watching me, unblinking. I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers began, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't have touched it." I ran. I don't remember much after that, only that I found myself standing outside the shop, my heart racing in my chest. The door was locked behind me, the shop dark and silent once more. The street was empty, and the man I had seen earlier was nowhere to be found. I never returned to the shop. The next day, I called Mr. Alastair to let him know I couldn't continue. He was silent for a long time before finally speaking. "I warned you," he said quietly. "It always chooses someone." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to, and to this day I wonder if it's still waiting for the next person to walk through those doors.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a typical first day. I had just landed my new job at a prestigious law firm, and after months of interviews and paperwork, I was ready to dive into the world of corporate law. The firm was located in a towering building right in the heart of downtown, its sleek glass exterior gleaming in the morning sun. The lobby was pristine, with marble floors and high ceilings, giving off an air of power and success. I couldn't have been more thrilled. They gave me a tour of the office, introducing me to a few colleagues as I followed behind. Most of the staff was quiet, busy with their work. Everything was so polished, so professional, that I almost felt like I didn't belong. But they assured me that this was normal, that I would fit right in once I got the hang of things. After a brief lunch break, I was sent to the archives room in the basement to retrieve some old case files for a senior partner. It wasn't exactly glamorous, but it seemed like a simple enough task. The basement was eerily quiet as I made my way down the narrow staircase. The walls were lined with dark wood panels, and the air had a distinct musty scent of old books and paper. The overhead lights flickered as I walked down the long corridor, and the distant hum of the building's air conditioning was the only sound that broke the silence. I was expecting a few rows of filing cabinets, maybe a couple of desks, but the room was much larger than I anticipated. It stretched out in front of me, filled with stacks of dusty boxes and shelves of case files. It was as though the room had never been fully cleaned or organized. I found myself getting lost among the towering piles of paperwork, unsure of which file I was supposed to retrieve. It was then that I noticed something strange. Among the boxes of documents, there was an old, leather-bound journal sitting on a dusty wooden table in the corner. It looked completely out of place, as if it had been there for decades. Curious, I walked over to it, my fingers brushing the surface of the journal. The cover was cracked, and the gold lettering on the spine was faded, but it felt heavy in my hands. I opened the journal, flipping through its pages. It was filled with handwritten notes, but the handwriting was strange. Messy, hurried, almost frantic. As I skimmed through the pages, I noticed a recurring theme. The names of people, most of them colleagues of the firm, scribbled down next to strange symbols. The entries seemed disjointed, almost like someone was trying to record something they couldn't fully understand. My heart began to race as I read a passage near the end. "They're watching. They know. It's too late now." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The journal didn't make any sense, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was trying to tell me something. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I heard a faint sound. Footsteps echoing in the hallway outside the archives room. My first instinct was to hide the journal, but before I could, the door to the room creaked open. I froze. A man in a dark suit stepped into the room, his eyes locking onto mine. He was tall, with sharp features and a cold, calculating gaze. I had never seen him before, but there was something unsettling about him. He didn't introduce himself or say a word. He simply stared at me for what felt like an eternity, his gaze piercing into me like he could see right through me. Without a word, he walked past me, his footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. As he passed, I noticed something even stranger. His eyes, cold and empty, seemed to flicker for a moment, like they weren't entirely human. The man didn't speak, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread flood over me. I watched as he walked over to the far corner of the room and stood in front of a filing cabinet. His hands moved with unnerving precision as he sorted through the files, as though he knew exactly where to find what he was looking for. I couldn't take my eyes off him. There was something deeply wrong about the entire situation, something I couldn't put my finger on. The man had no business being in the archives room, and yet, there he was, acting as though he had every right to be there. Suddenly, the air grew thick and the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The man froze, his back still to me. For a moment there was silence, but then I heard a low, guttural whisper, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Get out! Leave now!" I didn't know where the voice came from, but it was unmistakable. It was as if the very room itself was warning me, telling me to run before it was too late. Without thinking, I dropped the journal and bolted for the door. But just as I reached the doorknob, I heard the man's voice, cold and calm, behind me. "You shouldn't have come down here." I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. The man was now standing right behind me, his face inches from mine. His eyes were wide open, but there was no warmth, no life behind them. It was like staring into the eyes of something. Wrong. I'm sorry, I stammered, my voice shaking. I didn't mean to disturb anything. He didn't respond. Instead, he reached out with one hand and gently placed it on my shoulder. His touch was ice cold, sending a jolt of fear through my body. I wanted to scream, to push him away, but my body refused to move. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in this silent standoff, until finally he spoke again. "Leave this place. They are always watching." I stumbled back, my mind racing, unable to make sense of his words. But the panic was already setting in. Without waiting for another word, I wrenched the door open and bolted out of the room, not stopping until I reached the elevator. The elevator doors closed behind me with a soft chime, and I pressed the button to take me back up to the main floor. My heart was still racing as I tried to calm myself, but something told me that this was just the beginning. That man, the strange presence in the basement, it felt like they were connected to something much darker, something that had been buried beneath the surface for far too long. When I arrived back at the main office, I tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I wanted to forget about the journal, forget about the strange man, and move on with my day. But as I walked past the reception desk, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A photograph on the wall caught my eye. It was a black and white photo of the firm's founding members, taken decades ago. They were standing in front of the building, smiling, looking proud. But as my eyes scanned the faces, my heart stopped. One of the men in the photo was the same man I had just seen in the basement. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The man in the photo looked exactly the same, no aging, no changes in appearance. He hadn't aged a day. I knew deep down that I had stumbled upon something I was never meant to see. And now I had become part of something much darker than just a job. The firm wasn't what it appeared to be. And whatever happened in that basement, whatever curse or secret the building held, was now a part of me. I tried to leave that day. But just as the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, I felt a presence behind me, and I knew without a doubt that I was never truly going to leave.
Next story.
It was my first day on the job at this old, eerie office building on the edge of town. I had just graduated, and this was the first big break I had been waiting for. The company had been around for decades, and the building, with its creaky floors and dimly lit halls, seen its fair share of history. The job itself seemed simple: data entry and office management. The pay wasn't amazing, but it would get me started. I remember walking in that morning, feeling nervous but excited. The receptionist, a frail woman named Mrs. Jenkins, had greeted me with a tired smile and handed me a set of keys. "Welcome aboard," she said in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. "Just be careful on the third floor, all right?" I laughed it off, thinking she was just being eccentric, but there was something in her eyes that made me hesitate for a moment. After a quick tour of the building, which was even more rundown than I had imagined, I was shown to my desk on the second floor. The office was empty, save for a few stray workers here and there. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of old paper and something I couldn't quite place, the kind of smell you get when a building has been around too long and the air hasn't moved in years. My desk was by the window, which gave me a great view of the downtown skyline. But something about the view didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the fact that the window had a cracked pane or that the sun never seemed to fully shine through. The building itself blocked out a lot of the light, and it gave the office a dull, gray feel. I sat down and immediately got to work. The task seemed easy enough, just entering data into a computer. But as the day wore on, I started to feel watched. Every time I turned around, there was nobody there, but I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was standing behind me. I told myself it was just nerves. I was new, after all, and the building was old. But the feeling persisted. Around midday, I decided to take a break and grab a coffee from the kitchenette. The hallway felt longer than it should have, and the fluorescent lights buzzed above me, flickering slightly. As I passed the third floor stairwell, I noticed the door at the top was cracked open. I had heard rumors about the third floor, something about it being off limits. The few employees I had met spoke of it in hushed tones, but no one ever explained why. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly climbed the stairs. The third floor was worse than I imagined. The air was heavy with dust, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper. It looked abandoned, and it smelled like old, decaying wood. There were old filing cabinets lined up along the walls, some of them half open, revealing yellowing papers inside. I don't know what drew me in, but something made me step deeper into the darkness of the floor. Suddenly, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, a slow, dragging sound that seemed to echo off the walls. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but no one was there. I told myself I was just hearing things. It's an old building, I thought. The floors creak, the walls groan. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned to leave, but then I saw it, a shadow in the corner of my eye. It moved quickly, just out of view, and then stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I wasn't alone. Before I could react, I heard a whisper, soft and cold. "Get out." It was barely audible, but it chilled me to the core. I bolted toward the stairs, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was back on the second floor, breathing heavily. Back at my desk, I tried to focus on the task at hand. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The building seemed to have come alive after hours, the sound of creaking floors and distant whispers lingering in the air. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination and the stress of starting a new job. But then, things started to escalate. That evening, I was working late, trying to catch up on some extra paperwork. The office was nearly empty, just me and a couple of others in the building. The lights flickered again, and I heard a strange scraping sound coming from the hallway. I froze. It sounded like something, or someone, was dragging something heavy across the floor. I got up from my desk and cautiously walked toward the source of the sound. As I rounded the corner, I saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, standing in the middle of the hallway. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, hairy, cold, and malevolent. My breath hitched in my chest, and I couldn't move. It was as if I were rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away. The shadow suddenly lunged at me, and I screamed, stumbling backward. The air turned frigid, and the sound of my scream echoed through the empty halls. In that moment, I knew I wasn't alone in the building. Something was watching me, something ancient and angry. My mind raced as I tried to understand what was happening, but nothing made sense. The shadow slowly retreated into the darkness, and the temperature in the hallway returned to normal. I ran back to my desk, my hands shaking. I gathered my things, ready to leave, but something stopped me. The door to the third floor was ajar again. It called to me, beckoning me. Against my better judgment, I grabbed the keys Mrs. Jenkins had given me and headed up the stairs once more. This time, the third floor was different. It was no longer abandoned. The walls were freshly painted, and the old filing cabinets were gone. In their place were rows of desks, all occupied by employees hunched over their work. They didn't acknowledge me as I entered. Their faces were blank, eyes glazed over. They looked dead. I approached one of the desks, heart pounding. The man sitting there was thin, his face pale, and his eyes hollow. His fingers moved mechanically over the keyboard, but he didn't seem to notice me. "Excuse me," I whispered, unsure what to do. The man's head jerked up, his eyes locking onto mine. "Leave now," he rasped, his voice low and guttural. "You're not supposed to be here." I backed away slowly, but before I could turn to leave, I heard the sound of a door slamming shut behind me. The room went dark, and I felt the presence again. The coldness that had plagued me all day. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, elongating like dark tendrils reaching for me. "Get out!" a voice echoed, not from one of the employees, but from the walls themselves. I ran, stumbling through the darkness, desperate to escape. The shadows seemed to chase me, closing in as I bolted toward the stairwell. I made it back down to the second floor, gasping for breath, my hands trembling. I didn't stay another minute. I grabbed my things and ran out of that building, never to return. To this day, I don't know what happened on that third floor or who or what those people were, but I do know one thing: they weren't alive. I heard rumors after I left, stories about a fire that had ravaged the building years ago. Some said the employees on the third floor had perished in the blaze, their souls trapped in the building ever since. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but whatever I encountered that day was not of this world.
Next story.
It was a quiet, unremarkable town, nestled between the mountains, a place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever seemed to change. So, when I landed a job at a small local law firm that had been around for generations, I thought it would be the perfect way to settle into the community and kickstart my career. The office was located in an old brick building near the town center, one of those places with a lot of history and character, the kind of place where you could almost feel the weight of time pressing down on you when you stepped inside. I was fresh out of law school, eager to prove myself, and I thought this job would be my big break. The older attorneys at the firm were pleasant enough, but there was something about the place that unsettled me. The building had an air of neglect, like it was barely holding itself together. The walls were lined with faded portraits of previous partners, and the carpets had seen better days. But what really stood out was the office on the third floor. I had been warned about the third floor on my first day. Old Mr. Callahan, the senior partner, had given me a cryptic warning when I asked if I could work up there. "Stay away from the third floor after hours," he had said, his eyes narrowing. "It's not a place for people like us anymore." I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, it was just an old building. It probably had some history that didn't interest me, but there was something about Mr. Callahan's warning that stuck with me. The first few days went by without incident. I spent my time reviewing documents, making calls, and trying to adjust to the new routine. The other attorneys were kind but distant, and the office felt oddly cold despite the heat running in the building. Late one evening, after the others had left for the day, I found myself with some extra work to do, so I stayed behind to catch up. As I walked through the empty hallways, the quietness of the building began to feel more oppressive. The flickering lights above seemed to cast strange shadows, and the smell of old wood and dust lingered in the air. I passed by the staircase leading to the third floor, and for some reason, I couldn't resist the urge to climb up. I reached the top of the stairs and stood in front of the heavy wooden door. The brass nameplate that once read Law Offices of Callahan and Associates was now half obscured by years of grime, and the door itself looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. A feeling of unease washed over me, but my curiosity got the better of me. I turned the knob, and the door creaked open with an eerie groan. The air inside was colder than the rest of the building, and the room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the streetlights outside. The dust in the air danced in the beams of light that filtered through the grime-covered windows. I walked further into the room, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, that looked like it hadn't been vacuumed in years. There was a large desk in the center of the room, and on it sat an old leather-bound book. It looked out of place, as if someone had just left it there recently. Even though the rest of the room looked abandoned, I couldn't help but be drawn to it. I walked over to the desk and opened the book. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting was faded but still legible. It appeared to be a ledger, a record of some kind, though I couldn't make sense of it. As I flipped through the pages, a chill ran down my spine. The entries were dated decades ago, and each one was followed by a name. But the names were odd. Some were familiar, but others I didn't recognize. What struck me as strange was that after each name, there was a strange symbol, a cross inside a circle. I closed the book quickly, a sense of dread rising in my chest. I didn't know why, but I felt like I shouldn't be there. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A portrait hanging crookedly on the wall. It was of Mr. Callahan, but his face was distorted, almost as if it had been painted over with layers of dark ink. His eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, and I felt a tightening in my chest, like I was suffocating. I made my way back to the door, but just before I stepped into the hallway, I heard a voice. It was faint at first, a whispering sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Help me." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I looked around the room. There was no one there. The building was silent, save for the faint hum of the old HVAC system. But the voice, it was so clear. It wasn't my imagination. "Help me," the voice repeated, more urgent this time. It was coming from behind the portrait. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to investigate. I stepped closer to the wall and touched the frame of the portrait. It was ice cold to the touch. As soon as my fingers made contact with the frame, the whispering stopped, replaced by a loud, grinding noise that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Before I could react, the wall behind the portrait began to shift. The painting slid to one side, revealing a hidden door. My breath caught in my throat as the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Without thinking, I took a step forward. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old, damp earth hit me as I descended into the unknown. The stairs were steep, and with each step, the temperature seemed to drop further. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears as I reached the bottom. What I found at the bottom of the stairs was unlike anything I could have imagined. The room was large, filled with old, forgotten furniture covered in sheets. There were strange symbols scrawled on the walls, and the air felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. But it wasn't the room itself that terrified me. It was the figure standing in the center of it. A man, or at least what looked like a man. His features were obscured by shadows, but his eyes burned with an unnatural intensity. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, my legs refusing to obey as the figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Now, you're part of the ledger." The figure's hand reached out toward me, and in that moment, I felt a coldness that consumed me, a deep, suffocating cold. I closed my eyes, knowing that whatever it was, it had already taken me. But just before I lost consciousness, I heard one last whisper, "Help me." When I woke up, I was back in the office, lying on the floor in front of the third-floor door. The building was still, silent. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew something had changed. I wasn't the same person I had been before. I felt different, like I had been marked. I left the office that night, never to return. I don't know what I saw down there, and I don't want to know. But every now and then, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that whisper. "Help me."
Next story.
It was my first day as a janitor at the old hospital, and I was both excited and anxious. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was a job, and I needed it. The hospital itself had been around for decades, a towering structure of aging brick with dark windows that seemed to reflect the weight of time. I'd heard rumors about it, about the strange things that happened after hours, but I chalked them up to exaggerations. Still, something about the place gave me a feeling of unease, a tightness in my chest that didn't go away no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. My supervisor, a gruff man named Henry, was quick to show me around. He was old, with gray hair and deep lines carved into his face, but his eyes were sharp, always scanning his surroundings like he was waiting for something. He didn't say much, just pointed me in the direction of the janitorial closet and muttered, "Start with the lower levels and don't get lost. You'll know when it's time to leave." I nodded, not wanting to seem too nervous, though my stomach was already doing flips. The basement level was the first place I needed to clean, and as I made my way down the creaky, narrow staircase, I could feel the temperature dropping. It wasn't that cold, just a slight chill, but it was enough to make me pull my jacket tighter around me. The basement was eerily quiet. The walls were lined with old equipment, dusty shelves, and boxes full of forgotten medical records. The light above flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the concrete floor. I set to work, sweeping the floor and wiping down the counters, trying to shake off the nagging feeling that I was being watched. As I worked, I noticed something strange. One of the doors in the far corner of the basement was slightly ajar. It was an old metal door, rusted along the edges, and there was a faint smell of mildew and decay coming from inside. I wasn't supposed to be snooping around, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to investigate. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were lined with what looked like old storage rooms, but the further I walked, the more the air felt wrong. The hallway was cold, and the lights flickered with every step I took. It was almost as if something was moving just beyond the edges of the dim light, something that I couldn't quite see but could feel. I walked deeper into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hall, there was a door that wasn't like the others. It was solid wood, old but carefully maintained. It seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong in a basement full of storage rooms. As I walked closer, I could hear something. Footsteps. Soft, slow footsteps, like someone walking just on the other side of the door. I froze. My first instinct was to turn around and leave, but I couldn't bring myself to. Something about the door called to me, and against my better judgment, I reached for the handle. The moment I touched it, the door swung open on its own, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air was thick, heavy, and smelled faintly of antiseptic. Inside, the room was empty, except for a single metal cot in the center. The bed was stripped bare, and the room was otherwise devoid of furniture or decoration. But what struck me the most was the feeling that lingered in the air, something unsettling, like the room had been untouched for years. I stepped inside, cautiously, my eyes scanning the room. That's when I saw it. On the wall opposite me, written in what looked like red paint, were the words, "They never leave." I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The room felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, almost like they were reaching for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was in the room with me. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut, sending me into a panic. I rushed to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked it again, my heart racing, but the door remained locked tight. Then, I heard it. The sound of breathing. Deep, ragged breaths like someone or something was standing right behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The cot, the walls, everything seemed unchanged. But the breathing was getting louder, closer, as though whatever it was right at my back. I could feel the cold presence, the weight of something watching me. I turned again, desperately trying to open the door, but it was as if the room itself was holding me captive, trapping me inside. My pulse thundered in my ears, and my hands trembled as I fumbled for the handle again. But then, silence. The breathing stopped. For a moment, there was no sound at all, just the rush of blood in my ears and the faint hum of the lights above. I stood frozen, waiting for the next noise, the next sign that whatever I had felt in that room was real. Then, I heard a voice. Soft, barely a whisper, but clear as day. "You're not supposed to be here." I whipped around again, my chest tight with fear, but no one was there. The room was still empty, just as it had been when I entered. Yet the words echoed in my mind, over and over, like a warning I couldn't ignore. "You're not supposed to be here." I tried the door once more, and this time it opened. I didn't wait to look back. I bolted out of the room, down the hallway, and up the stairs, not stopping until I was back on the main floor of the hospital. My hands were shaking, and my heart was still pounding in my chest. I didn't say anything to anyone, not then, and I never mentioned the room to Henry or any of my coworkers. But I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched, the cold breath on the back of my neck, and the whisper that followed me long after I had left the basement. Over the next few weeks, I did my job, cleaning the hallways, the offices, and the rooms that nobody else seemed to want to clean. But every time I passed the basement stairwell, I felt that same nagging sense of unease. Something told me I wasn't the first person to have wandered down there, and that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't supposed to leave either. One night, as I was finishing up my shift, I heard footsteps echoing from the stairwell. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the darkened basement below. The sound seemed to grow louder and louder, but no one was there. I checked the hallway, the elevators, but there was no one in sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was down there, whatever was haunting the basement, was still waiting for someone to wander into its reach. And I couldn't help but wonder if the next time I went down there, I might not make it back out.
Next story.
I've always been a skeptic. Ghost stories, the supernatural, none of it ever felt real to me. I'd roll my eyes whenever someone would talk about haunted places or creepy occurrences. So when I got a job as a night security guard in a large old building on the outskirts of town, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just another boring gig to pay the bills. The building had been around for decades. It was once a factory, then a warehouse, and now it was being converted into office spaces. The place was mostly empty, with only a handful of tenants scattered throughout the building. The idea was simple. I'd patrol the hallways, make sure the alarm system was intact, and keep an eye on the place while everyone else was gone. The pay was decent for a night shift job, so I didn't mind the long hours. That first night, I was introduced to the building by one of the former guards, Tony. He seemed like a nice enough guy, but there was something about him that seemed off. His eyes were tired, and his hands trembled when he handed me the security keys. "Listen, kid," Tony said, glancing nervously at the stairwell. "There's a certain area you don't want to go in. It's on the 3rd floor. Just stay away from it, all right?" I didn't take him seriously. I thought he was just trying to scare me, so I smiled and nodded. "I got it. No 3rd floor," I said, mocking his serious tone. He didn't laugh. Instead, he looked at me for a long moment, like he was deciding whether or not to say more. Finally, he shook his head. "It's not like that," he muttered. "It's just, well, you'll see for yourself." After that, he quickly handed me the keys and left, leaving me alone in the building. The place was huge and cold, with the faint smell of mildew lingering in the air. I made my rounds, checking the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked tight. But as the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd hear faint noises, footsteps, the creak of a door, though every time I investigated, there was never anyone there. At around midnight, I found myself at the foot of the stairs leading to the 3rd floor. Tony's warning echoed in my head. "Stay away from it." I hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. It was probably just an old, abandoned part of the building. Nothing to be afraid of. I made my way up the stairs, the sound of my footsteps loud in the otherwise silent building. When I reached the top, I was immediately struck by how cold it felt up there, far colder than the rest of the building. The air was thick, almost suffocating. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The hallway stretched ahead of me, bathed in dim light from flickering overhead bulbs. The walls were covered in layers of peeling paint, and the floors creaked under my weight. I walked down the hall, my flashlight sweeping over the rooms. Most of the doors were locked, and there was an unsettling stillness to the place. But one door was slightly ajar, and I couldn't help myself. I pushed it open. Inside was an office, but it didn't look like any office I'd ever seen. The furniture was old, mismatched, and covered in dust. A broken clock hung on the wall, its hands frozen at 3:15. The air felt even colder in here, and there was a strange, metallic smell. I felt my stomach churn. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the far end of the room was a large, dusty mirror. It was cracked down the center, and the glass was cloudy. But what made me freeze was the reflection in the mirror. It wasn't mine. There, standing behind me, was a figure. A man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, like something out of the 1920s. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his mouth twisted in a grotesque smile. I spun around, but there was no one there. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, standing in the same position, but now his smile was wider, stretching unnaturally across his face. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and for the first time in my life, I was terrified. Suddenly, the mirror cracked even further, and the figure moved. He didn't step forward. It was more like he was crawling out of the glass. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, and slammed the door shut. I ran back down the stairs, my mind racing, my body on autopilot. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I had to get out of there. I reached the first floor and slammed the door behind me, my hands trembling as I locked it. I didn't know what had just happened. Was it a trick of the light? Was it my mind playing tricks on me after hours of isolation in that cold, dark building? I didn't know, but I didn't care. I wasn't going back up there. Not ever. I went home that night, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see that twisted face in the mirror. The smile, the eyes, the way he seemed to move. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Something had been up there, and it wasn't human. The next night, I reported for my shift, but Tony wasn't there to hand over the keys. His replacement, a guy named Jim, gave me a strange look when I asked about him. Tony, he quit last night, said he was done with this place. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't want to ask, but I had to know. Did he say why? I asked, trying to sound casual. Jim paused, looking me over before speaking. Yeah, he said it was the third floor. Something about the mirror. He looked uncomfortable, as if he was hiding something. I wouldn't go up there if I were you. Trust me. I didn't need any more convincing. I took my rounds seriously, but I avoided the third floor entirely. I stuck to the main floors, watching the monitors and checking the doors. But even so, I felt it. The eyes on me. The whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Around 2 a.m., I noticed something strange. The monitor that showed the third floor was moving. There was something there, in the corner of the screen. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. It was the man from the mirror. He was standing in the hallway, his back turned to the camera, his head twisted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat and ran out of the building, leaving the keys behind. I never went back. I don't know who or what that thing was. I don't know why Tony left or what happened to Jim, but I know this. Something is still up there, in that building, waiting for the next person foolish enough to step into that room with the mirror.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a simple, uneventful first day, the kind you hear about in the movies. I had just started my new job as a night security guard at a large, abandoned mall on the outskirts of town. The place had been closed for years, but a new company had recently purchased it and was planning to renovate it into a massive entertainment complex. For now, I was the only one on site, tasked with keeping an eye on things during the night shifts. Easy enough, I thought. How much trouble could an empty mall possibly cause? I arrived around 8:30 p.m., a little early to get settled in before my shift started. The building was even creepier in person than it had looked in the photos. The lights were dim, casting long shadows that stretched out in eerie directions across the hallways. The air smelled stale, like dust mixed with something metallic. As I walked through the front doors, I could hear the faint hum of the security system. Nothing too loud, just a low, constant noise that I grew accustomed to within minutes. The security office was small, just a tiny room with a desk and a few monitors. It looked like something out of a forgotten era, with dusty furniture and outdated technology. I settled in and started to go over the security protocols the company had given me. It was mostly routine. Check the security cameras every half hour, walk through the mall every hour, and make sure no one was lurking in the building. The first few hours were uneventful. I spent most of my time scrolling through my phone and watching the monitors. The mall had been stripped down, most of the stores gutted, with just bare walls and empty floors. It was hard to shake the feeling that the place was abandoned, even though I was technically supposed to be guarding it. The silence was unsettling. Every creak of the old building made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I was getting a little stir-crazy. I decided to do my first walkthrough of the night. The hallways seemed even darker in person, the shadows growing longer and thicker as I walked through them. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting weird, dancing shadows on the walls. As I passed by the old department stores, I couldn't help but imagine the types of people who used to shop here. It must have been a bustling place in its prime, but now it was just a hollow shell of its former self. I reached the back end of the mall where the emergency exit doors led to a service area. That's when I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. A soft thud. The kind of sound you might make if you dropped something heavy onto the ground. It came from one of the farthest stores. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing. It wasn't the sound of an animal, not like a rat or a stray dog. This was something deliberate, something human. I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself that it was probably just the wind or something else easily explainable. But then the sound came again. Another thud, followed by what sounded like shuffling footsteps. They echoed through the empty mall. They were coming closer. I froze, trying to steady my breathing. The security footage I'd been monitoring hadn't shown anyone entering the building. The doors were locked tight, and I had done a sweep just an hour earlier. No one was supposed to be here. The footsteps stopped. A thick silence followed, hanging in the air like a dense fog. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, not sure whether to investigate or call for help. But the thought of calling for help, when I was the only one there, seemed absurd. What was I supposed to say? Hey, I think someone's in the building, but I'm not sure who. Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence. It was faint at first, almost a whisper. Then it grew louder, clearer. Help me. I couldn't move. I wasn't sure if the voice was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, that whisper. It sounded too real, too desperate. It was coming from behind one of the stores, just around the corner. I wanted to run. I wanted to go back to the security office and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But my feet wouldn't obey. I turned the corner, my flashlight in hand, shining it into the dark space. At first, I saw nothing. The store shelves were empty, and the lights were flickering in and out, adding to the already unnerving atmosphere. But then, I saw it. A figure, hunched over on the floor. It looked like a person, but something was horribly wrong. Their limbs were twisted, bent at unnatural angles, as if they were crawling on the floor, but their movements were jerky and disjointed. I couldn't see their face, just the vague outline of a person covered in tattered clothes, their body shaking as if in agony. My mouth went dry. "Are you okay?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure's head jerked up, and I saw eyes, wide, unblinking, and hollow. The darkness in those eyes seemed to reach out, drawing me in. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving behind them. Something not human. And then, in a voice that made my stomach churn, the figure spoke again, louder this time. "Help me, before it's too late." I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get away from whatever this was, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. I tried to speak, to ask who or what they were, but the words caught in my throat. Suddenly, the figure's body jerked violently. Its limbs twisted even further, and I could hear cracking sounds, like bones snapping. It let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that was nothing like a human noise. I turned and bolted back down the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop running until I reached the security office. My hands were shaking as I locked the door behind me. I grabbed the phone, ready to call for help, but before I could dial, the power in the building cut out. The lights flickered and went black, plunging them all into darkness. But I could hear the faint hum of the emergency lights flickering to life, casting everything in a dim, unsettling glow. The voice came again, but now it was all around me. "You didn't leave. You didn't leave in time." I grabbed the flashlight and swung it around, but I saw nothing. The voice was everywhere, surrounding me. Suddenly, I heard the sound of dragging footsteps. Slow, deliberate, closer, closer. The door to the security office rattled, the lock straining under some unseen force. I pressed my back against the wall, my mind racing, trying to think of what to do. But there was no escape. I had made a mistake by staying, and now whatever was in that mall was coming for me.
Next story.
It was my first day working at the old restaurant, a family-owned establishment that had been in business for decades. The kind of place where the neon sign out front flickered to life each evening, casting an eerie glow on the empty street, and the smells of frying food and freshly baked bread seemed to seep into the very walls. I had been hired as a server, and while I was excited to start, there was something about the restaurant that felt off. When I first walked in for my interview, I noticed the old photographs on the walls, black and white pictures of the original owners, their family, and employees from decades ago, all smiling proudly in front of the restaurant. They looked so still, too still. And their eyes, they seemed to follow me as I walked through the room. But I brushed it off. I needed the job, and I had no reason to believe that anything was wrong. The first few hours were uneventful. I spent my time shadowing one of the senior servers, an older man named Sam, who moved about the restaurant with an almost mechanical precision. He was kind, but there was something strange in his manner. He spoke in short sentences, and when I asked about the history of the place, he would give me vague answers, often changing the subject when the conversation came too close to the restaurant's origins. By the time the evening rush began, the place had filled up with customers. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the room, and the noise of clinking dishes, chatter, and the sizzling of food from the kitchen became a comforting background hum. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. As I moved between tables, I noticed the mirrors on the walls. At first, they seemed ordinary, just part of the decor, but as I passed by them, I caught glimpses of things in the reflection that weren't there in reality. Shadows flickered at the edges of the glass, figures that seemed to move when no one was nearby. I thought it was just the light, the way the shadows played tricks on the eyes. But as the night wore on, I couldn't ignore it anymore. At one point, while I was serving a group of customers near the back of the restaurant, I saw a man standing in the reflection of the mirror at the far end of the room. He was wearing a black suit, his face obscured by the shadows, and his posture was unnaturally stiff. He was staring directly at me, his eyes not moving, just fixed on me through the glass. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I quickly turned around to look at the actual room. There was no man standing there. I blinked, trying to clear my head, but when I looked back into the mirror, he was gone. I told myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, maybe, but as the night continued, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. At one point, I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder, and I spun around to find no one behind me. I was alone in the hallway, and the only sounds were the clinking of plates and the muffled conversations from the dining room. Around midnight, after the last customers had left, I found myself alone in the restaurant with Sam. He was cleaning up, wiping down the tables with a practiced hand. I offered to help, but he shook his head. "You're new," he said softly, his eyes briefly meeting mine. "You don't need to be involved with the cleaning." I didn't understand what he meant, but I nodded and began stacking the chairs on top of the tables. As I did, I noticed something strange about the dining room. The lights, which had been warm and inviting all evening, now seemed cold, flickering slightly. The photographs on the walls no longer looked like old family portraits. They had changed, subtly. The people in them looked more pale, more drawn, as though their faces had been stretched out of shape. And the eyes, those eyes, no longer seemed to be simply looking at me. They were watching me, following my every move. My hands trembled as I continued working, but it was then that I heard it, the faintest sound, like a low whisper. I stopped and strained to listen, but the noise was gone. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The man in the black suit again, standing at the far end of the restaurant, just like before. Only this time, his face was clearer, and I could see his eyes, wide, dark, and unblinking. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, unable to move. I watched as the man's mouth twisted into a slow, deliberate grin. Without thinking, I bolted. I ran through the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. The air in the kitchen was thick, the heat from the stoves overwhelming. I rushed to the back door, but as I reached for the handle, I heard a voice behind me. "You shouldn't go." I spun around, but the kitchen was empty. No one was there. My mind raced, my body trembling with fear, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. The door was locked, and as I tried to turn the handle again, I realized the room around me had changed. The walls were closing in, the ceiling lower, the space more cramped. I could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was coming for me. I backed away, my eyes searching for a way out. My fingers found the edge of a large kitchen knife, and I grabbed it instinctively, clutching it in my shaking hands. My mind screamed for me to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. Suddenly, the lights in the kitchen flickered once more. And when they came back on, I saw him, right in front of me, the man in the black suit. His face was close now, his breath cold against my skin, his grin wider than before. He reached out a hand toward me, his fingers long and pale. I screamed, the sound echoing through the kitchen, and I ran. I don't remember how I made it out of the restaurant, but I do remember the sensation of cold fingers brushing against my arm as I fled through the back door. The last thing I heard before I ran into the street was a whisper, faint and chilling. "You'll be back." I never went back. I quit the next day, and when I told the other employees about what happened, they just stared at me. They didn't say a word, but I saw it in their eyes. They knew. The restaurant closed a week later, its doors boarded up with a "closed for renovations" sign in the window. But even now, I wonder. Maybe it's not renovations they're doing. Maybe the restaurant has changed, and now it's waiting for the next person to walk through those doors.
Next story.
It was my first day working at the old library, a position I had landed after months of applying and countless interviews. I had always loved books and the quiet serenity that libraries provided, so when I received the call offering me the job, I was ecstatic. The library itself had an old-world charm, with high wooden shelves stretching to the ceiling, ornate lamps lighting the aisles, and the faint smell of aged paper that only time could bestow upon a building. As I arrived that morning, I noticed how the library seemed strangely isolated. It wasn't a busy day, which I figured was normal for a weekday morning. I was greeted by the head librarian, Mrs. Green, an elderly woman with wispy gray hair and glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She seemed pleasant enough, but had a peculiar way of avoiding direct eye contact, as if she were concentrating on something I couldn't see. She led me to the back office, where she handed me a set of keys and gave me a brief overview of the daily tasks. She spoke quickly, but I caught the words "help with the old books," "do not disturb the restricted section," and "you'll be fine." Her instructions seemed simple enough, so I was eager to get started. After she left, I took a deep breath and surveyed my surroundings. The library was a maze of rows and rows of bookshelves, filled with volumes that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. There was something about the place that felt timeless, as if the building itself existed outside of normal time. It was both beautiful and eerie, and I couldn't quite shake the feeling that I wasn't completely alone in the space. I spent the morning shelving books, organizing old reference materials, and tidying up the public reading area. The silence in the library was deafening, broken only by the soft shuffle of my shoes on the polished floor. At noon, I took a break in the staff room, where the walls were lined with faded portraits of past librarians. Each one stared down at me with vacant eyes, their expressions frozen in time, as if they were watching over me. It was during that break that I first heard it, the sound of a door creaking open. I looked around, but no one was there. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the old wood of the building settling, but the unease crept back into my mind as the hours passed. In the afternoon, I was assigned to work in the restricted section, a dimly lit area at the back of the library. It was filled with old, rare books that were off limits to the public. Mrs. Green had made it clear that I was to be careful when handling these books. Most of them were fragile and irreplaceable. I wandered through the aisles, trying to get a sense of the place. The books in this section were ancient, their leather covers cracked with age, their pages yellowed and brittle. There was a heavy atmosphere in the air, like the very room was holding its breath, waiting for something. I pulled a few books from the shelves and began dusting them off, making sure to treat them gently. That's when I noticed the first oddity. At the far end of the restricted section was a book on a pedestal. It wasn't like the others. The cover was made of an odd, dark material, something between velvet and leather, and it shimmered faintly in the low light. It seemed out of place in the otherwise mundane collection, like it didn't belong there. The title on the cover was in a language I didn't recognize, and the book itself looked as if it had been untouched for centuries. I reached out to touch it, but as my fingers brushed the cover, I felt a sudden coldness shoot through my hand, like ice water running through my veins. I pulled my hand back quickly, feeling a rush of unease wash over me. The library was silent, but I could hear my heart beating loudly in my chest. I knew something was wrong. I should have left it alone, but something inside me urged me to open the book. I carefully lifted it off the pedestal and opened the first page. At first, the text was blurry, as though the letters were shifting before my eyes. Then, as I stared at it, the words began to clear. They weren't words at all. They were symbols, strange and twisting like nothing I had ever seen before. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. A chill swept over me, and I felt as if I were being surrounded by shadows. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and the room seemed to grow darker even though the lights were still on. I quickly closed the book, but as I did, a soft whisper echoed through the room. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, clearer. The voice was soft, almost sweet, but it carried an unmistakable menace. "Put it down." My breath caught in my throat. The voice seemed to come from all around me, and I felt an overwhelming pressure as if the very walls of the library were closing in. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, like I was rooted to the spot. I dropped the book onto the pedestal, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper faded, but the feeling of dread remained. I took a step back, my eyes never leaving the book, and I nearly stumbled over my own feet. The door to the restricted section creaked open again, and I whipped around to see Mrs. Green standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice tight. "I was just looking at the book on the pedestal," I stammered. "I don't know what happened, but you shouldn't have touched it," she interrupted, her tone sharper than before. "It's not for you." I felt a wave of confusion and fear wash over me. Why was she so upset? What was that book? I opened my mouth to ask, but she silenced me with a single look. "Leave it alone and never touch it again. Do you understand?" I nodded quickly, my eyes still glued to the book on the pedestal. Mrs. Green's gaze lingered on it for a moment, before she turned sharply and walked away without another word. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the book, about the coldness I had felt, and about the voice that had spoken to me. The library felt different now, darker, heavier, as though something ancient was watching me from the shadows. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of air felt like a warning. I didn't come back the next day.
Next story.
It was my first day at the new job, and I had no idea what I was walking into. The interview had gone smoothly. Too smoothly, in fact. The company seemed professional, the office was modern, and the people I'd met during the process were pleasant. Everything about it had felt like the right fit. But something shifted when I entered the building that morning. Something that I couldn't quite place, but it was there. The receptionist, a young woman with an almost unnaturally bright smile, directed me to the elevator. She seemed normal enough, but there was a vacant look in her eyes, as though she were stuck in a loop of pleasant politeness. As the elevator doors closed behind me, I felt a sudden weight in the air. The floor beneath my feet felt colder than it should have been, even for an office building, and I couldn't shake the odd sensation that I was being watched. The ride to the 8th floor seemed longer than it should have. The elevator hummed and jerked slightly as it ascended, and I glanced nervously at the numbers ticking up. When the doors finally opened, the stark white hallway before me felt empty. The lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting odd shadows that seemed to twist in the corners of my vision. I walked into the office with a smile plastered on my face, trying to shake the creeping sense of unease that was growing in my chest. My new boss, Gerald, greeted me warmly and led me to my desk. It was a small cubicle, tucked away in the back corner of the floor, far from the rest of the employees. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just where they needed me to sit for now. But the isolation of it felt off. I sat down, trying to focus on the computer in front of me. The glow of the screen was harsh in the dim light of the office, and my fingers hovered nervously over the keyboard. As I began working, I noticed that the office was almost eerily silent. There was no background chatter, no phone calls, no conversations. The only sounds were the low hum of computers and the occasional creak of the building settling. It was then that I saw it. From the corner of my eye, I noticed a figure standing by one of the windows at the far end of the office. It was a man, dressed in a black suit, his back to me. He stood motionless, staring out the window as if waiting for something. I blinked, trying to focus on the man, but when I looked again, he was gone. I felt a chill in my spine and shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe I was imagining things. But as the day went on, strange occurrences began piling up. The lights flickered again, but this time they flickered longer, casting the entire office in shadow. I glanced around, but no one seemed to notice. The coworkers at their desks were typing away, their faces emotionless, as if nothing had happened. I leaned back in my chair, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't long before I heard the footsteps. At first, it was just a soft tapping, almost like a faint echo coming from the hallway. But the sound grew louder, closer. I glanced up and saw Gerald walking down the hallway, his steps deliberate and heavy. His expression was unreadable. He didn't stop at any desks or acknowledge anyone as he passed by. But what struck me the most was the unnatural rhythm of his steps. It was as though his feet weren't quite hitting the floor in the right way, as if he were gliding instead of walking. I froze in my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of his footsteps continued, growing louder and more distinct. But then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. I waited, breath held, but Gerald didn't return. The silence in the office became suffocating. I stood up, my mind racing with confusion and anxiety. I needed to find out what was going on. I decided to ask one of my coworkers about it, the strange atmosphere, the flickering lights, and the footsteps I'd just heard. But as I approached one of the desks, the woman sitting there, her name was Sarah, I think, didn't look up from her screen. Her fingers moved rapidly over her keyboard, but her eyes were fixed on the monitor, blank and unblinking. I cleared my throat and tapped lightly on her desk. "Excuse me, Sarah?" I said, my voice almost sounding too loud in the quiet room. "I just wanted to ask about..." She didn't respond. She didn't even acknowledge that I was there. I waved my hand in front of her face, but her expression remained the same, vacant and distant. My stomach twisted. Something was wrong. I turned and quickly walked away, my head spinning. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. I decided to leave for the day. The unsettling feeling had become unbearable. But as I turned toward the elevator, I saw him again, the man in the black suit. This time he was standing in the middle of the office, just staring at me. His face was obscured by the darkness of the hallway, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I rushed to the elevator, pressing the button repeatedly as I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, growing louder. My heart raced, and the doors finally opened with a soft chime. I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The doors closed just as I heard a voice, a low, gravelly voice that sent a jolt of fear through my body. "Don't leave," it whispered. The elevator descended rapidly, and the pressure in my chest eased slightly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. When the doors opened to the ground floor, I bolted out of the building, my legs shaking beneath me. I never went back.